Hello, everyone. My name is Denise Hall from the Ferguson Public Library, and I am introducing L.J. Cohen, who is a novelist, poet, fiber artist, potter, and relentless optimist. After 25 years as a physical therapist, L.J. now uses her anatomical knowledge and clinical skills to injure characters in her science fiction and fantasy novels. She has written 8 novels. Last one was published in summer of 2018. Derelict, the first book in the series, was named a Library Journal Self E-Select Title and Book of the Year in 2014. So I'm going to skip that and say, and we also have Ryan. I'm going to have to ask you to pronounce your last name for me because I have not done that yet.
That's okay. Nobody ever gets it right on the first try. It's Toxopeus.
Toxopeus. I was going Toxopeus, but I wasn't sure. So Toxopeus. Ryan Toxopeus is an award-winning writer, has finished his Empire's Foundation fantasy trilogy, and has begun the follow-up series Strongblade Sunblooms, whose first award was received in university when he entered the short story contest with the work of fiction that chronicled the Dutch resistance fighter in World War II. He has published 4 novels, currently working on his 5th, and was honorable mention in the L. Ron Howard Writers of the Future contest. He keeps the mantra, if I am bored writing it, readers will be bored reading it. Which seems like a good plan to me. So, those are my 2 authors. They are both published. They are both science fiction fantasy authors, but that doesn't necessarily matter whenever you're starting a writing your story, to at least in my opinion. So what my program is, your story starts with you. We're talking about just how to get started. So what do you all recommend for just how to get started?
Well, I think for me, it comes down to why are you writing, or why do you want to write? So there's a few different motivations. It can be anything from money to just having a story inside of you that you need to get out. And so those are treated entirely differently. Because if you're writing for money, there's usually schedules involved, publishers involved. It's more of a job. Whereas if you're doing it because you've got a story inside you that you need to get out, it can be a labor of love. So it's different.
Yeah, I think most of us start out writing because it's a labor of love. And at some point along the way, it's nice to be able to share that story with somebody else. And whether you share that story for free on the internet, or you publish your book to get it out there, or you find a publisher, those are all 3 very different pathways and very different processes. But it all does start with getting words down on the page.
So how do you start getting those words on the page? Do you just...
So I have always been someone who journals, and my first journals, I think, are back when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. And having a time where you show up and you are disciplined enough to just write whatever comes to mind, even if all you're writing is, I have no idea what I'm writing, over and over again. There is value to making an appointment with your pen and paper or with your computer, because writing is both art and craft. So the art is the creativity, but if you don't have the craft skills to back it up, the art's not going to go anywhere. And so for me, journaling is part of my craft and my practice. It's akin to, if you're a musician, you practice scales. You're not going to go on tour with your band and play scales. But every musician I know practices their scales virtually every day. And that's why I think journaling or having any sort of morning pages, which is from a book called The Artist's Way. I believe it's by Julia Cameron. She talks about morning pages, setting up a timed writing every day or every week. It's the equivalent of scales if you're a musician.
And that's interesting because that I've heard a lot of writers talk about that kind of almost ritualistic nature of writing, where you set down your schedule and like, this is when I'm doing this, this is when I'm doing this. Like, and some authors will plan out almost every hour of the day. For myself, it's a little different because I've got a lot on my plate other than writing. So it's more a matter of when can I find time to write. I've got the day job. I've got my kids every other week, girlfriend, friends. I've run Dungeons and Dragons games on the side. So the time that I can find to do things related to writing and marketing and all that is limited. So it's more a matter of, oh, do I have a few extra minutes here? I'll jot down a few hundred words, or maybe I'll get lucky and get 1,000 words done in a day. But it's, I know there's writers that run the spectrum there, where, you know, some will be diligent about it and get those words down every day. And some, maybe you're writing once or twice a week, and that's okay too.
And it is absolutely, that is okay. I am not prescriptive in any way, shape, or form. And you will hear a lot of writers say you must write every day if you're going to be a real writer.
Yeah.
I think that puts undue pressure at a time when we're already under so much pressure in all aspects of our lives. And I have learned not to put that pressure on myself, and I certainly won't put that pressure on other people. What I do think is important is to make time for some kind of creativity every day. And sometimes that's taking in creativity. That's reading a story, going to a museum, taking a tracing of a tree, or going to a cemetery and tracing, gravestones. Something that feeds your creativity in any way possible ultimately is going to lead to you being a better producer of creative work.
I agree with that 100%.
I can tell you that when I hit writer's block, and I did viciously for a good year and a half, I dove into one of my other creative pursuits, which is pottery. So this is one of the things I make. And the more I had my hands in clay, the less I was doom scrolling on Twitter, and the more my mind was free to imagine. And I think spending that time not writing, but doing something else creative, helped me break through the logjam.
Absolutely. For the last couple of years, I've had problems getting words on the page. So I kind of shifted gears just because of personal things going on in the pandemic. There's just no gas in the tank for writing. But I shifted gears, and I've been running a couple of D&D campaigns for the last 2 years now, and so I've still got that creative outlet. It's still creating worlds and storytelling, just in a different format.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that you can do that feeds and nurtures your creative side is all part of finding your story, finding your voice, telling your story.
So do you have tools that tools for writers that you would prefer over others? So like, do you prefer paper and pencil? Do you prefer typing it into a computer? Do you prefer text-to-speech programs or anything like that?
For me, it depends. I don't like text-to-speech because it doesn't really work with my process. I don't tell myself a story. I know other writers who do. For me, it's the kinesthetic of either writing or typing that's super important. And it depends on the kind of writing. So if I'm doing free writing, just free association writing, or writing poetry, those happen with a pen or a pencil and a notebook. And there are writers who have rituals. They have certain pen they use. They have certain notebooks they buy. I go during back to school season to Staples when they have their 39-cent single subject college ruled notebooks, and I buy like a dozen of them. And in the course of a year, I end up filling them all up. But that's a lot of my journaling and my poetry and free writing. When I'm working on a novel, I feel like I need to be at the keyboard because my brain spins faster than my handwriting can keep up with.
Yeah, my process is similar. I don't get the notebooks. What I'll have is loose leaf paper. So if I'm, say, on the bus to work, I'd have my notebook that I would have for work. But if creative ideas came up, then just flip to a new page and get writing, rip it out. And I've got a drawer full of just stacks and stacks of paper, whether it's maps that I've drawn or plot outlines, or even snippets of chapters where I'm like, oh, I've got this idea for how this conversation is going to go. I need to write it out right now while I'm thinking about it so I don't forget. And so it can happen anytime. So I always like to have paper handy, even if it's not necessarily a journaling notebook. But when I'm working on the novels, it's the same thing. I've got to be at my keyboard because I can type somewhere between 60 and 80 words a minute, which obviously I can't do with a pen.
The worst is when you write yourself a note and then you look back and you have no idea. It's like, I know that's my handwriting, but what was I trying to tell myself?
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes I don't even use the notes that I've written, even if it's about a book that I'm working on. I'll forget that I wrote a note. And then I was just going through my notes a couple of weeks ago showing my son, because he's getting to that point in school now where he's doing some creative writing and stuff. I said, listen, if you get any ideas, write them down as notes so you've got them, because it's amazing how often you forget something that you're like, oh no, what was that thing that was so perfect? And so I was going through those notes, and some of them were for the book that I just published. I was like, oh, I forgot I wrote these notes years ago. And so some of this stuff's pretty good, and some of it didn't.
But you know what? The stuff gets into your subconscious. And I think even if you don't consciously review your notes, writing it helps release me from the anxiety that I'm going to forget it. And then I remember it, or if it's relevant, it'll come out in the words. At least that's my experience. And I think the one piece of advice I like to give writers is trust your subconscious, because your subconscious is a whole lot smarter than you are.
It's true. Also trust your characters, but that might be related.
Trust the story, I wrote this 5-book space opera series. And when I wrote the first book, I had no intention that it was going to be a series. In my mind, it was just a standalone book. And I put a bunch of supporting characters in that I didn't think I had put a lot of thought into. They served a purpose in the narrative. But then as I get into book, say, 2, 3, 4, my subconscious had laid the seeds of all of these things that blossomed in later books that I know I never consciously planned. And yet, if a reader looks at it, they'll look back and go, whoa, look at all that. She knew she knew this character was going to do X, Y, and Z. And I had no idea. None. My subconscious, I guess, knew better.
Yeah. In my case, some of the characters that I was writing about, I did know where their story was going over the long term, because for my books, at least most of the first 2 series that I'm writing were actually done at the gaming table, playing D&D. So they were inspired by D&D. They don't strictly follow what happened at the table, because what happens at the table rarely translates well into novel format. So there's been a lot of reworking that's
I mean,
happened.
hey, you're following a very tried and true. That's where The Expanse came from. The sci-fi series
Yeah,
came from their tabletop campaign. So yeah, that's pretty
yeah,
awesome.
it is. And so like I'll know roughly, like I'll plot out a rough plot before I start writing, just so in my brain all the steps are there. But then sometimes the plot changes as I'm writing if something comes up and one of my characters disagrees with where I wanted to take them.
Oh God, that happens just in the writing.
Yeah.
And people who are not writers, they I was talking to my spouse about this, and I was saying, I was writing this scene, and then this character decided that's not how the scene went and changed it completely. And he gives me what I consider the golden retriever head tilt and says, "But you're making this up, right?" I'm like,
If only it were
"No,
that simple.
no, that's not how this works."
Yeah, they kind of take on a life of their own sometimes.
Yes, they
Like
do.
in my third book, I had a plot point where two of my characters were going to go off together, but then the circumstances that led up to that, one of the characters was like, "This is insane. I'm not doing that." It's like, what?
Wait, what?
There's a whole new plot arc that just appeared out of nowhere in the middle of this book that I have to deal with now.
Leaving the author to play catch up.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not
So
in charge.
I was just discovering the story as it went, type of thing, and it wound up being better than what I had plotted originally. So that's why I say, trust your subconscious, trust your characters.
Trust the story. Trust in the story that you're telling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of covers the question, which was a lot of authors I've heard in talks like this have said, the story writes itself and you just kind of follow along and put the story to words. And but yeah, so you kind of covered that question, is how do you feel about that?
I mean, it does, but it doesn't. There's a ton of work that. All right, let me backtrack. As many authors as there are in the world, are as many processes as there are to write. I always say to people, if there was only one way to get a story down, there'd only be one craft book. But if you go to the shelf in the library, there's like there's thousands of craft books. So clearly there isn't just one way to write a story. And I know people, extremely amazing writers who write phenomenal stories, who outline everything before they begin to write. They literally have, 1A, 1B, 2. I can't write like that because for me, my first draft is discovering the story. If you break it down to sort of its most basic, you have people who say they are plotters and people who are pantsers, and plotters write the outline and pantsers go by the seat of their pants. I think that's a false dichotomy. I start with a sense of once upon a time there was, these things happened, and then this is how the end goes. So I have a sense of who my characters are at the beginning, at least the bare bones of them. What happens at the beginning to send them off into the story. I often have a few scenes in the middle that some writer a long time ago called candy bar scenes because you can't wait to unwrap them and eat the candy. And then I sort of know where I'm shooting for in terms of the end. But all along the way, the story meanders like a river as a river changes course, right? And anywhere along the way, like Ryan said, your characters can say, nope, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I don't know why you thought I would do that, but that's not it. I'm not doing that. And so you've got to sort of flex and flow and still, for me, hold to the major shape of the story. So the shape of the story is the tent, right? What happens inside the tent is anybody's guess. But that's my process. And other people have vastly different processes. And in fact, what works for one story may not work for the next story you write. And
That's
being
entirely
flexible is
true.
important.
That's entirely true. Like my process is different depending on what type of story I'm writing. So if
Yep.
I'm writing a novel, I'm kind of like you, I'll have kind of a hybrid approach where I'll have like a loose outline and then fill in the blanks as I go and kind of discover the story pantsing style. But it's certainly not full pantsing. uh, I really admire those people
I
who
do
just
too.
write without any idea of where a
Oh,
story's
God.
going. And like, how do you have an end product that makes any kind of sense when
It
you
would
do
not work
that?
for me either.
No, no. But if it's something shorter, like a short story or a novella, then I'm much less, not that I'm all that rigid with the plot to begin with, but I'm even less so with that. Like sometimes I will just pants a short story because I'm like, okay, here's a character that I want to know more about, maybe from my main series, or maybe it's something else. Like I had a short story that was spawned from an experience that I had where my van broke down in the middle of nowhere in northwestern Ontario. We didn't have cell service or anything. And then I had a dream of a moose walking out into the middle of the highway in the night with glowing red eyes. And
Ooh.
I was like, that's the perfect thing for this thing that happened with me. And I'm going to put them together and make a
Yep.
short story and just see where it goes. And it was amazing. I had so much fun with it. So yeah, the process is different depending on what I'm writing.
Okay. Let me think. How about, so what would you recommend for a completely new writer that wants to write but doesn't know what they want to write?
Ooh, that's a hard question.
Yeah, I might start off writing short stories or even flash fictions, which are short stories that are less than 1,000 words, just to get some ideas down and build the craft of writing slowly. Like you don't want to start with your magnum opus where you're writing this huge book as your
Yeah.
first thing. That's what I did, and it was not a great approach. And that book also will never see the light of day.
Yeah, I
Was
think we all
it
have
was
one like
terrible.
that. I have one, then every once in a while I just read a little of it to remind myself I in fact have gotten a lot better. Because
Yeah.
you don't realize, right? Yeah, every once in a while I think maybe I should just post a scene to show people just how bad my starting point was. It's pretty bad. For the
I
writer
don't.
who doesn't know what to write, I highly, highly recommend writing to a prompt.
Yeah.
Because, so my first writing love was poetry. I started writing poetry when I was elementary school, maybe, and I've been writing it my entire life. And when I hit writer's block, which is not one thing but many things, and we can talk about that if you want to. But when I hit a point where I don't know how to organize my brain, I find a prompt. And so earlier in the year, I actually asked people on my social media to throw 6 unrelated words at me. And I would take those 6 words and incorporate them into a small poem. And the amazing thing was how good those poems ended up being, and how creative I felt in taking the constraint of 6 random words that somebody would throw me. And there were people who threw me bizarre words. There were a couple words I had to look up because I had never heard of them before. And yet it unlocked creativity in a way that then allowed me to write other things. So sometimes having constraints is like having guardrails or training wheels on your bicycle. And it really helps.
Yeah. When I moved to Saskatoon, I was looking for a writers group because I had one when I lived in Guelph. Well, I ran one when I was in Guelph with a bunch of other sci-fi and fantasy authors. So I was looking for something similar here where we get together and chat. But their structure was that they did writing prompts together. So they had dice to roll up random prompts,
Nice.
like you'd have and it was the same idea, like throw me some random words or images or whatever, and I've got to make a story out of it,
Yep.
including as many or as few of the dice as you wanted. And then sometimes they would just have seen a writing prompt through the week, and they'd write it down, and then all of us would write just a page
Yep.
regarding that. So it gets the creative juices flowing um, in
You
kind
can
of a
also,
community.
yeah, you can also play a game I call Writer's Clue. So you get a random name, object, and place. So instead of like Colonel Mustard in the library with the candlestick, you have, Space Captain grounded on a alien planet and a monster, and you just go from there. And it doesn't really matter. You just write a page, a paragraph. You write for 15 minutes or whatever. And amazingly, story ideas come from those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes they don't too. Sometimes you
Sometimes
just
they
write
don't.
something and it's like, okay, that's done. I'm never doing anything
And
related to this
sometimes
again,
it's
and that's
just
okay.
fun. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
silly and fun, and you get a good laugh out of your bizarre brain that creates the weirdest things.
Yeah, for sure. So um, uh, I've been parts of several different writing communities, both in person and online. We had a great writing community on Google Plus. There were so many of
Yeah.
us there that
Google Plus.
we'd share ideas and stories, and it was so nice to have that community. And so I've had less success finding groups like that online since. Probably the closest that I've come to is now there's a Discord group that's small that I mentioned that we're putting together this anthology with. And, so it's getting there. They're building up, and I'm hopeful that it'll turn into something, because there have been so many times that I've joined a writing community and they're like, oh yeah, here's what we want to do, and then it's just silent for months, and it's like,
Yeah.
okay, this one's not working out.
Yeah, I think the importance of
So,
community cannot be overstated. Writing is such a solitary endeavor, and I don't think we can be our best creative selves by ourselves.
No, I absolutely agree with that. Like I've been finding authors and writers on TikTok to follow as I've been creating my own account there, and just hearing about other people's processes, other people's interests, maybe some of their insecurities and mental health issues, and all of that kind of thing. It's really important
Yeah,
to realize that I'm not alone. There are other writers out there who feel the same way I
yeah.
do, and
Especially when on
great.
social media we tend to see only the happy stories.
Mhm.
And then if you're sitting there beating your head against the metaphorical wall and, cutting 30,000 words from your story at a go because they're not working, you think, I am the only writer that is failing, or I am the only writer that is struggling. And the truth is, we all struggle, and most social media is just a really highly curated fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't. I try really hard to not judge my own progress and success against other authors and writers, because my journey is my own. As long as
Yes.
I'm improving and can see improvement in my own writing and my own processes and stuff, then that's
Right.
what really matters. And that's what I try to focus on, because you're right. Social media is a hive of scum and villainy.
Villain, yes. Yes.
they're,
And
they're
to something you said at the very beginning, Ryan, if I were in this purely for the money, I would still be working as a physical therapist.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I make hobby income from my writing, and that's okay
yeah,
because I'm in a place in my life, we're empty nesters, our kids are out, they're independent, all their schooling is paid for. It's just my husband and I don't need to make an income for my writing. I write because I'm driven to. I write because I want to share my stories. And the people who have read my work, it means something to them. And sort of my base goal is the books need to earn out their production expenses. And as long
Yep.
as they do that, I am a happy camper.
That's basically what I'm looking at too. Like I've got my day job to cover the cost of living.
Yeah.
And like when I get a bit back from income tax at the end of the year, I can put that back into my books or whatever. I'm hoping that now that I've got 4 books out there, they'll start generating legs of their own
Right.
and cover those production costs. So far, I've broken even because I did some crowdfunding early on for my early books. That was pretty successful. Like it covered the cost of art for the
Nice.
books, and then I was working with my ex's aunt as an editor. So she was just happy to do it for the fun of doing it,
Yeah.
which is a huge cost savings because depending on the editor that you're getting, it can
Right.
be pretty pricey.
That's the
So,
single largest expense in producing a book is, for me, editorial.
yeah. And I mean, you get what you pay for, all right? Because I had an editor that I paid for my first book, and she charged me about $900, which was quite inexpensive. But she
Yes.
was new to editing novels at the time. Like she was doing more student papers type thing. So she had no experience doing novels, and apparently it showed. Because
Yeah.
when my ex's aunt read it, she's like, "You paid for that?"
Cringe. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like, oh no.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, she's a real stickler for the rules too. So for someone like that reading the book, it
Yeah.
was bad. But I had already had other people who had read it who really enjoyed it too. So
Right.
it's, I wouldn't say it was a waste of money.
Right.
Like if that's what you can afford, that's what you can
Right.
afford. You'll still find readers even if it's not
Right.
perfectly polished.
Right. Right. I mean, you definitely want to put out into the world the best product you can at the time,
Yep.
but we all have limitations on our time and our budgets. And if you're in this for the long haul, you'll always go back at your first books and cringe, saying, "Oh, I could do," the impulse to re-edit an old work is strong, and I
Oh
have to,
yes.
at every turn, it's like, nope, this was the book I could write at the time, and it is still a good story, and you can't go back. You have to just keep going forward.
Exactly, because I mean, there's diminishing returns
Yeah.
going back and
Yeah.
rewriting a book. And I mean, I've had positive reviews on that first book. The first book is
Right,
rated like
right,
4.1 or something like that on
right,
Amazon, right? So I'm
right.
like, it doesn't really need to be reworked, but I read it and I'm like, oh,
Oh, I'm
I'd
so much
really like
better
to,
now.
yeah, I'd love to
So
go
that
back and
kind of
rework this scene or
so
something, you
that
know?
reminds me of like 2 pitfalls for new writers. One is, and I have talked to 3 writers just in the past 6 months who desperately want to write, and yet they don't ever start.
Mm,
Right? They're just constantly thinking about this story they have, but when I ask, "How much of it have you written?" and they're like, "Well, I haven't written anything." I'm like, it's not how this works. You
yeah,
can't write a story without actually writing the story. So
exactly.
for that writer, I try to convince them to start the practice, an active writing practice, even if they're not working on the book that they want to write. Because if they don't have that skill set, they haven't practiced their scales, they're not going to be able to sit and write. Like, if you wait for inspiration to strike, you're never, ever, ever going to get anything done. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Like, inspiration has to find you with an active discipline of some sort. And I'm not saying you have to write every day, because I don't write every day. And I don't think you need to put that sort of pressure, but you need to have some kind of writing creative discipline, right? And then the other kind of writer I see is the writer who has one thing written and they rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it and never move on.
Or even the writer who starts with one chapter and then goes back and edits it again
Over
and again
and
and again.
over and
They
over.
lose all momentum and they never get the story done. They just give up because they're
Right.
like, oh, I can't get it perfect. So you can't be a perfectionist to that level with
Right.
especially your first story that you're writing. Like, it's
I mean,
just
hell, anything, because it's so easy to go back and it's like, oh, this isn't right. And I'm going to focus on getting every word polished and beautiful.
mhm.
And that's a delaying tactic.
Yeah.
You
Oh yeah,
know?
absolutely. I remember, I can't remember who said it, but someone said typos breed in the wild. So like, even after you've published your book, you're going to
Yes.
find things wrong with it. It doesn't matter how many times you've gone through it. It's just infuriating.
And if you focus on trying to get, say, a scene perfect before moving on, I'm not saying you don't fix egregious timeline problems, right? But if you're focusing on the sentence level of the story before you finish the rest of the story, you're working at cross purposes with yourself because, first of all, you don't want to edit at a sentence level if, when you're finishing the whole novel, that scene may get cut anyway. So why are you
Exactly.
polishing something that may end up on the cutting room floor when you have a 100,000 word novel done and you realize, my first 3 chapters were throat clearing and I can just cut those right off and I can start with chapter 4 and it's much stronger here. So, yeah, it's all about getting out of your own critical way and letting the story breathe in your mind on the page, however you need. Just keep going with your story.
And I think that's something really important for new writers to hear, is that your story is not going to be exactly as you wrote it in your first draft. There are going to be scenes that get cut, even at the editing level.
Right.
Like I sent my third book off to a developmental editor, and she came back with one scene. She's like, this doesn't do anything for the story. It doesn't move it forward. It's just kind of flat. I just cut this. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, my baby.
Yeah.
I had a reason in my head for that scene being there, but then if it doesn't serve the story, I guess it doesn't need to be there. And
director's cut.
It's exactly. Yeah, because in my third book, actually, I'd had another POV in it for the main villain, and I got about halfway through and I was doing the developmental editing for book 2 with somebody else, and they said, oh, you can just cut these scenes as we don't need to see the antagonist throughout the whole thing. It might actually be more of a surprise when you get to see the antagonist later. And maybe you could do like a novella or something with the antagonist and explore that backstory and what's going on and stuff. And so that's exactly what I wound up doing. And I really like that because it left a lot more mystery. Like, there's still a few scenes in there from the antagonist's point of view, but not as much. So it cut it down, made it an easier read. And I'm just really happy with how that turned out.
You mentioned a lot about editing and publishing. So what do you recommend? How do you recommend new writers go about finding an editor or publisher? Should they try to self-publish first, or should they go looking for a publishing house? I mean, how do you get there?
Oh boy, that's a question you can spend a few hours on just by itself. But I would say, and this is completely my opinion, like there's no right or wrong answers here. I would personally say you start small. A lot of people start with short stories, and there are tons of websites out there that have open calls for themed anthologies, and perhaps get yourself involved in some of those themed anthologies as a way of dipping your toe into the publishing world. And some of those are done as indie projects, some of those are done as small press, most of them are small press, a few of them are done at the, big five, whatever level. But I think getting involved in that level of publishing gives you a sense of, is this something that fits my work? Is this something I want to work on? Some of us jumped right ahead and started writing novels. I don't know that I would always recommend that, but I did. My first novel was like Ryan's, a mess. It was like almost 200,000 words of awful, like at every level. I didn't recognize how bad it was, and I started querying agents for it. The really scary and sad thing is, I actually got requests for the full novel off of that, and it was bad. Like, it was unreadable. It's trunked. It will never go anywhere. In fact, my first published novel was probably the fourth or fifth novel I wrote. So if you're looking to publish books, you're looking at a really, really long, slow road. And that's even if you independently publish, it's a slow road. If you traditionally publish, it's even slower. It could
Yeah,
be years. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll tell new writers that it's a marathon, not a sprint. Like, if you want to write books, you're in it for the long haul. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They think, I'm going to write this book and it's going to be a bestseller and I'm going to be a superstar. And
Oh,
it's
you
like,
sweet summer child.
yeah. And then you got to kind of ease them off of that and be like, do you know how many writers there are out there? Like, I'm sure you can name a few, and then there are thousands and thousands more beyond that who never get that level of recognition. So it's nice to have that dream, but don't expect it, is what I would say.
And in terms of finding editors, there's a couple of things I want to say about that. First, I would recommend that people do at least some level of peer-to-peer editing with a writing group, because you want to catch at least the low-hanging fruit, and sometimes all that takes is somebody who isn't invested in the story the way you are, because it's your story. So if you can do critique trades, even with writers that are at your same level of writing, there's a great deal of value in that. Because what you don't want to do is take your absolute first draft of your first novel and pay an editor $2,000, because that's the going rate for a really good editor for a novel length project, only to waste their time on a novel that needs much more development before it's actually ready for prime time.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. Don't send anybody your first draft ever, because I remember my first experience with NaNoWriMo, which is what is that?
National Novel Writer Month.
Right. I was looking at publishing websites before I'd even heard of it, and all of them have a line that says, "Do not send us your NaNoWriMo projects," because pounding out 50,000 words in a month is not going to be high quality writing, and sending especially the first draft of that is just going to be terrible. And I imagine they got a lot of those. So all these people who are so excited they wrote their first novel, and just to get it shot down.
And here's the thing: everyone's first drafts are terrible. Even if it's your 15th book, your first draft of every book is terrible. It
That's
just is.
that's how I look at it. Like I don't let anybody see my first draft. I'll go through 2 drafts. Just like my first draft is to get all the ideas down. Second draft is to clean that up. Third draft, I read it out loud because it's amazing how many errors
Oh,
you catch
yes.
when you actually slow it down and force yourself to read the words on the page. Because it's so easy for your eyes to just skip over mistakes if you're just scanning
Yep.
it, because you know what you meant to write,
Yep.
but actually reading it out loud, and if you can read it out loud to someone else, if you have someone who's good at catching errors and stuff, or asking questions, that can be another
Yep.
layer of
So I
editing.
actually have sometimes done having Adobe Acrobat read it to me. And
Oh,
yes, it's going to stumble on any unfamiliar words, especially if you're writing sci-fi and fantasy,
mhm.
but having another voice read it and you just listen, you hear all the things.
Yeah, I mean, there are some mistakes that I would still miss that way, because I there's a lot of rules in
Oh
English
my
and writing
God.
English, that you basically need a professional editor,
Right.
because they know them all and they will catch everything.
100%
Well,
of the time, I get wrong the laid, lay, lane. I get
oh
them
yeah,
all
me
wrong. I
too.
get them wrong. I cannot. I know there are rules. I can look them up. They don't stick in my head. I'm like, the editor will
Nope.
catch that. That's
Yeah,
what I'm
and
paying
then
them for.
yeah, and then writers will also have ticks, where they do the same
Yes.
thing over and over again.
Yes.
And like, I don't see it when I'm reading it, and my editor's like, "Oh my God, this is like the 50th
Again?
time you've done this.
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
please change it up?" I'm like, oh, I didn't even know
You
that was
know,
a thing.
and there are programs out there that will look at frequency of phrases, frequency of words, and I have over the years compiled a list of my problematic words, words that
Mhm.
I overuse, words that I always misspell, and so I will do a search for those words at the end, so that again I try to get as much of the low hanging fruit as I can before it goes to an editor because I want to pay my editor to do the work only they can do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what are some of the other costs associated with publishing?
What are the other costs associated with publishing? Well, if you're self-publishing, um, so cover art, um, layout, depending on whether you're doing print and or ebook layout, and editorial are the 3 sort of major production costs. Um, it ISBNs, which if you're in America, you have to buy. If you're Canadian, you're lucky enough you get those. ISBN numbers are, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's the way the books are cataloged as books for sale. You can look them up by ISBNs. Um, if you're publishing through Amazon only, technically you don't actually need an ISBN because they give you what's called an AISN, which is an Amazon specific number. But if you want your books beyond Amazon, you really should have your own. Um, I think those are the major ones. Ryan, did I miss anything?
Well, for layout, I was going to actually point out that for Amazon, they have Kindle Create.
Yep.
And so you just put your Word document in there and it auto formats everything. And it's wonderful. I used it for my 4th book and I'm never going back to doing that manually myself. Like,
Oh man, I'm
there's
so picky. I have a whole system. I do it all manually.
yeah, there's a couple of things that I wasn't terribly happy about, because in my previous books, like, when a chapter ends and you've got like a couple of lines on a page and then it goes over to the next chapter, I would manually shorten the spacing between lines on the previous 2 pages so
Right,
that
right,
wouldn't happen.
right.
But Kindle Create doesn't let me do that. So I just kind of had to go, okay, I got to give this one up because I don't want to do the whole thing myself
Yeah,
again.
I have developed a bunch of templates So it's actually a pretty easy process for me, and I do the ebook and the print at the same time. And I don't have any fancy programs. I use OpenOffice for my print stuff, and then I use a free program called Sigil, which is a ebook editor for my ebooks. And it's not hard to learn if you're the least bit technical, and it doesn't really even take that much time anymore because I sort of have a template, and it's almost automatic at this point. But if you don't have those, then it's going to cost to get your books formatted.
Yeah. And like I do have templates from my previous books. I just wanted to try out Kindle Create
Yep.
to see what it was like. And I was so happy with it that it did both the ebook and the print book
Nice.
at the same time. And I was like, oh man, this is so fast and easy.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty happy with that. Other costs, well, you can get into things like post-production, like marketing.
Right, advertisement and marketing, but that's
advertising, yeah,
different.
but
I'm just
that's-
thinking of the production stuff.
Yeah. No, those are the two main, the three,
Yeah.
potentially three main costs. So for sure, you want the cover art and the editing, and then layout. You can figure out how to do yourself, or
Right.
you can pay someone else to do it.
So I can tell you that I budget about $3,000 to get that's all my production costs for any given novel. You can do it
that's
cheaper.
what I've got. That's what I've got slated for my next book, is I'm going to get the cover art done, and my cover artist Harvey Bunda. The cover varies from $500 to $750, depending on how much detail is on it.
Yep.
And then the editing for the rest. So it's for new writers who are just getting into it.
It's a little daunting. It's not. Yeah. You know, it's not a small cost.
At the same time, we are at the point in our writing careers where we've got several books out, and so we are at that level where we're paying that kind of money for really professional cover art and really professional editing. When you're just starting out, you don't need to think, I need $3,000 to do my first book. Oh my God. Like I did mine on a shoestring budget. Yeah, I did my own cover on a digital book because I didn't bring out a paperback until I got the actual art done. Like you can put it out at an earlier phase digitally, and just see how it goes, see if people even like it. So that was the kind of process that I did, because when I wrote my first book, very much like yours, I wrote it to be a standalone. I didn't know if anybody would even find it or like it. And it wasn't until I got a couple of 5-star reviews from complete strangers that it was like, okay, I'm in.
Somebody likes this. Yeah, that's cool.
Time to sink some money into this and hope that I find some more people who like it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask LJ. LJ, what one question would you like to answer?
Oh boy, what one question would I like to answer?
What you would have asked as a new writer? I'll put it that way.
So I think the most important thing I would have liked to have known is encapsulated in what you named this talk, that your story starts with you, that the more specific, the more personal you make your story, the more it reflects your unique experience, the wider the audience you will have. And I know that sounds counterintuitive. And I guess if I were to pull that into a pithy sentence, is you can't write for everybody. Because if you do, you're going to write a generic story. So you write the story that is burning in your soul to write, that is meaningful and personal and is you on the page. Even if you're writing space opera, fantasy, whatever, if it's passionate, if you are passionate about it, you will come through, and that story will have appeal to others.
Okay. Ryan, same question for you.
There is no perfect book, because that's what it boils down to. There's no book in existence that everybody loves. It just doesn't exist. There will be a critic for every book out there. You think about the most widely selling books, the most widely known authors out there. If you go and look at their reviews, there will be 1-star reviews. Every book. Doesn't matter how famous the author is, there will be people who don't like it, whether it's because that book didn't follow what the person expected it would be based on previous work that the author did, or whether there's some kind of theme in there that they didn't like. It's just there's countless reasons that you'll get 1-star reviews. I think the most upsetting one for me was when I gave away 3 copies of my first book through a Goodreads giveaway. And like I wrote out what the book was, what the genre was, storyline and everything. So, you'd think that people who are signing up for a giveaway would read that and know roughly what they're expecting, but they don't. They just sign up to win. And so the idea is that these people are supposed to give you reviews when they in your book, and I got 1 review out of 3, and it was 1 star, not even a full review. It was a rating, just a 1-star rating. So I don't even know what they didn't like about it, and it's eaten at me for years. But the one thing that one bit of advice that I will give to new and upcoming writers is never respond to your reviews, especially those negative ones, because you can fall down social media a pit of death by doing that kind of thing. I've seen there was one writer, not even a published author yet. She had her first book and she was so excited about it. She put it on Goodreads in advance, like weeks or months in advance of when it was going to be published. And somebody just saw it there and posted 3 stars. And she's like, it's not even published yet. How can you leave a review? Like this is, and she went on this huge tirade about it. And the guy was like, it just didn't seem like something that was going to be super exciting to me. So I rated it 3 stars, and so she lost it on him, and he came back with all of his Goodreads friends and they trashed the book before it was even out. So she had dozens of 1-star ratings and reviews with no book. And so it just destroyed her book before she got started, and she wound up giving up.
Reviews are not for you as the writer.
They're for other readers to know if this is going to be a book they like. And because like I've seen 2- and 3-star reviews on books where they say something negative about a book, and I'm like, actually that sounds exactly like the kind of thing I like, so I'm going to pick up that book and read it.
My favorite 2-star review for Derelict, which is the first book of my sci-fi series, was this 6-paragraph screed about how I was ruining the morals of young people and disrespectful, and how dare I ruin science fiction with a lesbian relationship. And
oh my God. Yeah.
And the thing is, all of the things, like you say, that review has netted me more readers because they were looking for a book like that. Right? Those were features, not bugs. So right. It is my favorite review because clearly I struck a nerve.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because the book that I just released it's more diverse than my first trilogy was. So I've got people of color and LGBTQ protagonists, and so it's completely different than what I'd done, but it spoke to me, and it was meaningful to me. So I did a lot of research into the lived experience and all this type of stuff before I published, and I'm just terrified of getting those reviews, because
you will happen. And the other piece of advice that I heard was, if you're not getting negative reviews, your book is not getting wide enough exposure. Because if all you're getting are positive reviews, then your only readers are friends and family. So
that's an interesting way
getting
of looking
negative
at it.
Reviews means your book is getting traction out in the world, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. and what one person sees as negative isn't necessarily negative. Like there are people
Exactly.
who will rate books that they love as 3 stars.
Right.
And I'm like, what? The rating thing on Amazon says that it's okay, but you're
Right.
saying that you love it. How does that
Right.
make sense?
Right.
So, you know, just
It's random and capricious, like so many
Yeah.
things in life.
exactly. So for new writers who are looking to get published, don't put too much stock in those reviews.
No.
Reviews that aren't 5 stars are still valid and good, and just don't wade into the weeds. Don't cause controversy.
Well, you were talking about there is no one perfect book for everybody, and the one that gets me in trouble a lot is I can't stand Tolkien. Cannot stand him. Cannot stand his writing style.
Yep.
Cannot finish. I barely finished The Hobbit listening to it on audio. But
yeah,
so that's an example of one author is not everybody's cup of tea.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I get in a lot of trouble for fighting over Tolkien online because I read The Lord of the Rings once all the way through, and I will never do it again. My buddies in high school were
I'm
like,
one of those geeks. I read the Silmarillion. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like I just find it's way too slow for my tastes, and yeah, I can't do it again. I love the movies. The movies are amazing because he generated so many amazing ideas, and so I see a lot of value in Tolkien's work, but I can't read it again.
No story is for everyone.
Exactly.
My favorite example of that is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which won all these awards the year that it came out. And it's this huge tome, right? And I'm reading the first chapter and it friggin' has footnotes in it. Okay? I don't want my fantasy books to have footnotes that I have to study I mean, I'm not a lazy reader, but I found it pretentious, overwritten, overwrought. I didn't get past the 3rd chapter. And yet, it's an award-winning, it spawned a TV series, it's people's favorite books. I think it was my least favorite book that I've read in the past 20 years. But that doesn't mean it's a bad book. It means I didn't like it. It wasn't written for me. That's okay.
That's exactly right. That's a good way of looking at it. Your book that you write is just not going to be for everybody, and that's okay.
That's okay.
You'll find your audience.
So, do we have any more questions? Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, we have. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
I'm certainly available if people want to email if they have specific questions. I know you have our contact information. You can certainly give that out, and I'm happy to answer people's emails.
Oh yeah, I'll talk about writing all day long. That was part of the thing in Guelph was we'd get new writers in and we'd discuss all this kind of stuff every month and get together. So I love talking about the writing process and everything involved in it. And yeah, the best way to get a hold of me is probably through the Facebook writing fan page that you've got linked for me. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Well, I've got LJ's and Ryan's contact information on the website and in our blog. You can also contact me at the library at thall@fergusonlibrary.net and get any more information. And I thank you all for coming, and I will let you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
It was really fun.
Yeah, it was